You got it again. Casual conversation, cartoon curriculum. As soon as possible, as simple as possible. A&P, we're chapter 5, first installment right here. Reminder that the best way to learn this material is to use your textbook, an e-book, or a solid book. Also compare it to the general practice questions that we gave you. And then, of course, look at the graffiti, because this is the best source of information. These two come in second, but this is where the tests basically come out of. So if you want the details beyond casual conversation, go to the text right here. It's got all the good stuff on it. But the general practice questions are taken from the textbook, and the graffiti is created from the general practice questions, and vice versa. Okay, here we go. Big and general stuff again. In chapter 4, we talked about the cell, and we talked about the structure of the cell, unique features of its outside, yada yada. But in chapter 5, we're talking about tissue. So this is histology. Chapter 4 was cytology. Right off the bat, the definition of a tissue is it's the cells and the cell products. These are cells that tend to function together, but it's not just the cells, it's the material between the cells, and the cells make up that. We like to make the analogy that a cell is like a brick, a tissue is like a brick wall. A brick wall is not just bricks, it has mortar in between it. So it's the stuff between the cells also. For big general features right here, some big general things. Remember we said that there's approximately 60 to 100 trillion cells inside the body, but here's something else that's kind of unique. There's approximately 60,000 miles of blood vessels inside the body, because in a very generalized way, diffusion is limited. How far a material can diffuse away from a blood vessel is significant, and 6 cell spaces is kind of a rule of thumb, that if something is more than 6 cell spaces away from a capillary, it's potentially in a dangerous situation, not being able to get all the materials it needs nor get rid of its waste products. So to make sure that each cell is relatively close to a capillary, it takes approximately 60,000 miles of blood vessels to service all those cells right there. Now, tissues of the body are generally divided into 4 fundamental groups, and that would include epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous. In this chapter 5, we're going to focus our attention on epithelial and connective tissue. For epithelial tissue, we're going to say this is found on the surfaces of the body, the natural surfaces of the body, and in gland tissue. So, function of epithelials right here, where they form coverings of the body, such as the epidermis. Epidermis is an epithelial tissue. By the way, remember, epi means upon. So this is upon your skin. The epithelium also makes the coverings of things such as individual organs inside the body. So therefore, the capsule surfaces of organs inside the body have epithelial tissues on them. Coverings, linings are included in coverings. It's a covering on the inside of a tube and inside of the cavities of the body. So inside the cavities of the body, you have mesothelium, which again is like a wallpaper material. And then inside of tubes, such as a blood vessel, you have epithelium, such as the endothelium. Epithelial tissue is also involved with creating and just being gland tissue. And so here is an example. Embryologically, glands invaginated from a surface. Now, if the tissue invaginated from the surface but maintained a connection to that surface, and these things began to produce extra materials, the extra materials could move through that opening to the surface. This represents an exocrine gland, a ducted gland. So secretions are going to a surface. This is like oil going to the surface of the body, or sweat to the surface of the body, or saliva to the inside lining of the mouth, or pancreatic juice going to the inside of the stomach. Again, the glandular tissue is epithelial. Sometimes, however, there's an invagination of this material embryologically, and it loses its connection to the surface. If that's the case, it can still secrete material, but now the material may be caught up inside blood vessels, inside the bloodstream. And so now we're talking about endocrine glands. And the endocrine glands are called ductless glands. And what it's secreting into the blood stream is considered to be hormones. Here's some basic epithelial structures. When we look at epithelial tissue, we expect it to have high cellularity and very little interstitial space or fluid. High cellularity just means that there's a lot of cells packed into that space. They're like boards in a fence. Next, we have at least 3 different surfaces we have to identify. There are the lateral surfaces where the cells touch each other. There's the basal surface where the cells are touching the next tissue below that. Something called a basement membrane we found down here. And then there's the free or apical surface, which is the surface, either of the outside of the body or the inside of a tube or a structure that has a cavity inside of it. So this is the surface where things are absorbed, where things are released. It's the working side of the cell. If we look at epithelial tissue, some other things that seem to be quite obvious, these things are packed so close together there's no room for any blood vessels, so epithelial tissue is avascular, where A means not. The vascularity is found below a basement membrane. Now the basement membrane is sort of like the backing to a carpet. It helps hold these things up against something else. And the something else would be connective tissue, very often areolar tissue. That connective tissue, very often areolar tissue, is vascular. So this is where the good stuff is. They can diffuse out to these individual cells and keep them alive. An example of this relationship between the basement membrane, the connective tissue, and the vascularity issue is epidermis. With epidermis, that is the outside of your skin, here's the basement membrane, there's connective tissue below it, and here is a blood vessel inside the connective tissue. Now, because diffusion only works over a short distance, that means that everything near the basement membrane has good diffusion, good nutrients, good metabolism, and good health down here. But as you get away from the basement membrane, everything becomes poor. The diffusion is poor or non-existent. There's poor nutrients, poor metabolism, and very poor health. And because of that, the cells begin to die as they move to the outside of this tissue right here. Now, also when it comes around to mitosis, mitosis is possible down here because there's all the raw materials that are needed for mitosis. But as it gets out here, the cells become so unhealthy that no, there's no reproduction going on out this way. So you have layers of dead and dying cells moving to the outside of the body. It takes approximately 40 days for a cell made down here to be pushed up towards the top, and in the process of being pushed out there, it dies, dehydrates, and basically becomes just a little bitty wafer of a protein called keratin, giving this thing a tough texture, giving this thing out here just dead. There's nothing out here that most parasites would want to eat except for dead flaky skin, and you do flake these skins away. In class, or if you read through the materials, some strange examples of this epidermis flaking away. Dandruff is a good example of that. Approximately 30% of the dust in a normal house is old skin cells that fell off the people that live there. If those dust cells get on the heating coils and you turn a heater on, you get a strange smell like something is burning. That may be dust, that may be old skin cells burning up. Inside air ducts of your house, the dust, the skin cells in the dust, make good food for dust mites, and there's a kind of an odor that's associated, a mustiness associated with that. Old bedding, when a person lies down in bed and moves around, they sort of defoliate, they exfoliate themselves, and old skin cells can become embedded inside the threads where dust mites, again, can eat and leave a unique odor to it all. Having nothing to do with dust mites, but back to the idea of flaking away, the inside of your mouth is flaking away just like the outside of your epidermis is flaking away. And since there are bacteria that commonly live inside your mouth, these things tend to eat the flaked off cells, and they create waste products, and those waste products build up and become a large part of your morning breath. You can brush, gargle, and do all kinds of things, but if any bacteria are left behind, there's a possibility of a stronger breath to it all. Chemotherapy is a part of this storyline too, because the bottom cells are the stem cells, and as they reproduce, they push cells to the surface. So the thickness of your epidermis, or the thickness of any lining, such as your mouth, pharynx, or esophagus, has to do with the health of these stem cells down here. Most chemotherapy tries to slow down mitosis in your body with the idea that your cancer cells will be slowed down will be less likely to multiply, to overwhelm an area, and perhaps your immune system, your white blood cells, can move in and take care of this hindered group of rogue cells. Unfortunately, it also hinders normal cells, and so therefore the inner lining of the mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, and small intestine may become thinner than usual. So a person in chemotherapy very often complains about upset stomach and diarrhea and things like that. Also, the skin becomes thinner, so sores may be more possible. Wounds may not heal as easily, and hair is a product of the epidermis, and hair may begin to fall out. As far as epithelial functions are concerned, there are, let's see, basically protect, secrete, absorb, filters, excrete, and reception. So that's to say P-safer as an easy mnemonic for remembering that. So of course they protect you. They are your outer barriers, you versus the world, whether it's the lining of your digestive system or the outside of your dry skin. Because glands are epithelial tissues, of course, secretion is part of epithelium. Because you have to get things through the barriers to be able to make it part of your body, say in your small intestine, absorption is a function of epithelial tissue. Inside your lungs, it's the epithelial tissues that filter materials from the atmosphere to your blood. Excretion is taking waste products, pushing them through a surface and throwing them to the outside. And of course, recognizing what's going on anywhere outside of you is a matter of getting that signal through the epithelial tissue.